a dream that I had since I was 10. And it didn't make any sense to me then. It wasn't scary, so it wasn't something that I was. I would talk to my parents about it, but it was just kind of didn't seem like anything. I didn't have any knowledge to understand it, but basically, I'm in a desert, a specific desert, which I feel like I've located. I think where it is. It's not even in Egypt or anything, but this desert. I'm walking in the desert. I have strange clothes on, clothes, ancient looking kind of clothes. I'm not can't see myself. I can only see my hands, and I'm holding a staff, and the desert is completely barren. And I take the staff and I find the same location every time in this reoccurring dream, and I hit the staff into the sand. And then from there comes these concentric circles that light up, golden concentric circles that light up around me, come underneath the sand and out. And then there's 12 spokes that light up in that circle. And all those dots light up. And then dream ends.
To a Broaderlands podcast. The opinions expressed on Broaderlands podcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlands podcast. Alyssa, welcome to Broaderlands podcast. What an honor. I really mean that. Yeah, thanks
for coming. To be here.
Yeah, thank you. I became a fan of you when I first seen you on Ancient Civilizations, and that first episode I gave an interview with you talking. I don't see that anymore for some reason. But I actually, I loved everything you had to say, and I love Ancient Civilizations, and I loved your work, so I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, well, I left Gaia 2.5 years ago to start my own company, Hathor Studios. And so they might have taken it down because even though I created that show, they, someone else there is now continuing to produce it. I'm no longer there producing it, but so maybe they took it down for that reason.
Yeah, thanks. How'd you come up with the name Hathor Studios?
Well, it's a complicated story. Well, it's not that complicated. I had actually, considering the audience, I had gone to Egypt to do a film scout with Graham Hancock and his wife. And we were doing we were doing all the temples he was going to talk about in the show, and we went to Dendera. And I'd always wanted. This is my first time there, so I thought, wow, I love this temple. It's so beautiful. If anybody that's listening's been to the Temple of Dendera, it's just they've preserved as much as they could the paint. The paint was obviously redone back in Grecian times, and they kept the blue paint, and it's just an amazing, beautiful temple. So we did a walk through what he was going to talk about. And then I just told them, I'm like, hey, I just want to walk around by myself. Now, if you've ever been to this temple, I mean, it's huge, but it's not like you'd walk around it and you wouldn't get lost. There's no way you would get lost. There's not that many levels. It's not that big that you wouldn't find anybody. But so they were doing their thing in the Great Hall, and I walked around. There's a Holy of Holies in the middle, and then there's 12 rooms around the Holy of Holies. Amazing. And I went into one of the rooms, and all of the rooms actually have hieroglyphs, but there's no antiquities in any of them. They're vacant. So I went into just one random room, and I felt compelled, drawn, put my hands on the wall of that room and my forehead in the middle of my hands. And when I did that, I'm going to try to explain this feeling as much as I can. I felt every single human emotion at the same time. I felt love, I felt hate, I felt depression and sadness and greatness and joy, like all at the same time. And I saw all these colors coming through my body. It was a very intense experience. That amount of energy doesn't have a bad or good feeling. It's just intense, right? Mm-hmm. So this is happening to me. I release my hands from the wall and step back, and I'm like, whoa. So I'm standing here like this. And the archaeologist, Egyptologist that we were with comes running the room. He's like, where have you been? And I said, oh, I've just been in here. And he said, you've been gone for 2 hours. We couldn't find
Wow.
you. I had like missing time. And I said, well, I've been right here, and that's impossible. And then he saw kind of where I was hovering over, and he said, do you know what that says? And I said, no. And he said, receive the goddess here. And
Mm.
it was that was a that was a crazy moment. But then what happened 2 weeks after, for 2 straight weeks after that thing that happened to me, I would dream of the temple. I would see symbols and code that would take me there. I would highlight them. It would move them around. And then I would draw them out when I woke up, and I would send them to the Egyptologist. And I'm like, do you know where this is in the temple? And what does it mean? And it was pretty intense for 2 weeks, and then it started to fade. But after that, I thought to myself, if I ever start my own company, I'm going to call it Hathor Studios, because what is in that temple is a frequency we cannot see. We are not in touch with.
Yeah.
And it wanted me to understand what it was that exists on our planet, but we cannot see it. We don't understand how it works. It's the real workings of the universe that are masked before our eyes, that we just can't grasp because we've been so trained into such a reality.
And that was in the Dendera temple.
Yeah,
You
the
talk,
Temple of Dendera, Hathor's temple, which is why I called my company Hathor Studios.
speaking of that, in your new film, Code 12, I've been there. I've seen that scene. I was just there maybe about, I don't know, 9 months ago.
In
Um,
in Dendera?
yeah, and I seen that black spot, that square. It looked like a square kind of. And my first thought was it was a tile that came off. That was my first thought because my conditioning, but looking at old ceilings and stuff. But yeah, I've seen that, and I remember looking at it like, what happened there? And then I seen it in your film. Maybe you can touch on that if you don't mind. It's like the Zodiac scene or something like that, right?
Yeah, so in the film, it's called Code 12, and we talk about how in every ancient text, and what seems to be almost every ancient science or modern day science, there's a reference to a coding of 12, whether it's the ultimate traversing time and space through a 12 pointed sacred geometry shape, or our original DNA, or the zodiac, which is 12 right now. Um, there's a pattern, and there's a pattern in all the ancient texts, the Bible, anything spiritual. It all references in some strange form 12 of something that equals
Right.
something. So when you're in the Temple of Dendera, the Temple of Dendera for Hathor is a temple to the goddess, but it's well known for the zodiac, which is what we were there for. Graham Hancock was going to talk about the zodiac. So when you walk into the grand hall, which is you've probably seen these pictures if you Google the Temple of Dendera, you walk through the main door and you look up, and there's all these four-sided faces of Hathor and this beautiful ceiling that's blue. And on that ceiling are all the zodiac symbols in order of when they are in the sky. Also, on the second level is a chamber where there's a circular zodiac representation, which is also depicts all the signs as well. Now, in the order of all the 12 zodiac, there is there are only squares on the ceiling. There's one in the middle between Scorpio and Sagittarius that's blacked out. Like, it literally looked like somebody took a magic or a Sharpie and blacked it out. It's that black. And like you said, you thought, well, oh my God, it must be like a missing tile or something. It's so black. You're like, oh, they have to fix that part of the ceiling. And that is definitely what we talk about in this documentary, because somebody had just come back from Egypt, and they said, well, what is that? Why is it blacked out? And they said, oh, it's just dirty. Now, when you look at this, I wish we could see a picture of it right now. If you look at this, it looks like somebody literally drew in between the lines. Like, it's not that the whole ceiling is dirty, it's just that they never wanted to clean this one square. They wanted to keep it dark, they wanted to keep it hidden. And if you are able to wipe that away, you'll see that it is the zodiac symbol for Ophiuchus. And Ophiuchus is always in the sky between Scorpio and Sagittarius. And in the circle of the zodiac, of the 12 zodiac, Ophiuchus is number 13 and it's in the middle. Now, this is a very important point. Now, the name of the movie is called Code 12 because I don't want to give it away for you, but Code 12 is some kind of ancient structure that depicts what we are in and how things work. How you move that structure and traverse it, whether it's time and space or change it from everything from your body to your DNA to your thoughts to the existence of the next level of a dimension, is through those 12 points. So number 13 through so this point through the zodiac in the middle, in the center. And so this is depicted, you can see Ophiuchus in the round one as well, but it's not focused on because no one talks about it. Nobody talks about it unless you're into esoteric symbolism. But by deleting the 13th zodiac, we've created a new time structure that we all live in. The 12 months, the 12 hours a day, the 12 hours a night. And if you study Egyptian text, or, if you understand, if you go into the temples and you read like they talk about the Book of the Dead, the 12 days a night, the 12 hours of night, the 12 hours of the day, right? It's so important to them. Why is it so important to them? They literally have it in every temple, as if we forgot that there's 12 nights. Like, and it's always this really grand mythology, like, oh, the god Osiris had to survive the 12 hours of night into the dead and the underworld, and then he comes back and he rises again. We have the same story with Jesus, right? He rises again. In this setting is because it's creating a construct of time of which we live in. And this gets into the main point of the documentary. It's unraveling this code, which in a way is a depiction of a matrix or a simulation that we live in that has been created by someone or something, and they've deciphered it and they know how it works and they know how to move it, they know how to use it. We do not. We just look at those beautiful hieroglyphs and we're like, wow, that's a really good story,
Wow, that's amazing. I don't know if you know of Tony Browder, Anthony Browder. He's the first African American to have a site there. He's had this site since 2007. He's been going to Egypt since 1979. But Tony, he calls it a metamorphosis. When he takes people, we eventually have some kind of metamorphosis that happens, some kind of like awakening, some kinds of realization. And when I first landed there with them, with the group, and I had a crazy experience because for me, a lady, we landed and a lady started crying. I don't know if she was a part of our group, but she was in this big plane, right? And she started crying, saying, "I'm home." And when she was crying, like I felt all of her emotions in me. And I felt all like that multi-generational trauma from what happened, through slavery and all that stuff. But anyways, I realized that we're all one. And I already knew that, but it was just a great reminder that we're all one and no one heals until we all heal. It was just a beautiful, I call it a metamorphosis, like Tony calls it, because that was my first experience with some type of deep awakening in ancient Egypt. Yeah, it's well, what's your take on the helicopter? Those crafts. I took pictures of that. It's way up there though. It's high up.
Well, I just want to say something on what you just experienced. I think that that's a really important point before I go on to the helicopter. Everybody likes to talk about the helicopter. I think I wrote about that in an Ancient Aliens episode that I produced, but like a long time ago, before everybody started doing tours and looking into the helicopter. I just want to that touch on that. I think I've only met a couple people, and they were very brief. They were just people in a group. I didn't have a relationship with them. They were just, talking. I've only met a couple people who never want to go to Egypt, who don't want to see the pyramids. There's an obsession we all have as humans. It's kind of like even Atlantis, the story of Atlantis. This is something I talk about in Code 12 too. This obsession with this lost civilization, this great lost civilization that existed, and then we misused the technology and it fell apart. It's this age-old story that Plato told, and it's been written, and before his time it was written, and it's in the walls of Edfu, right? It's this thing that is ingrained in our psyche. And what is it warning us? Like, what is it telling us? And the driving to Egypt, this mass curiosity that we're all trying to understand about ourselves. It's not necessarily about the lost civilization. It is about a piece of each one of us that are interested in Atlantis or Egypt that has been lost. It's been broken.
Yeah.
That we're trying to get back that piece of us, and it's universal, and it's so fascinating
Yeah,
that
it is.
it's the same in all of us, and what that is it's something I'm exploring for the next doc that I can't really talk about because it's pretty mind blowing, and it just came to me. I got a phone call, and it was a weird discovery. So I think that this awakening you had where you felt other people's emotions, I think this is happening all the time. We just can't tap into it until we're in a place like Egypt, because it's so active there that it ignites these pieces, these memories in our DNA that we can't do at home or down the street or in a big city where it's too complicated with different energy, right? And so it's very important, and what that play, how ancient civilizations and esoteric knowledge will play a part in our future for humanity is going to be really interesting. We can all pontificate. I have, right? I've been doing that for a while, writing TV shows about it and researching it. But I think it's a serious thing for each of us to figure out what it is that we've lost, and
Yeah,
how that will help us in the future.
yeah, you're right. It's like this remembrance is trying to emerge within our DNA, within us, and
Yeah.
it's starting to pop up everywhere within
Yeah,
us,
it's
little by
not
little.
coming from the sky or, like creatures in the caves, it's within us that all of that is coming up. It's a secret. It's being revealed. It's unlocking itself into all these things. And I mean, we could keep talking about that, but I'll get on to the helicopter because that's more fun. I mean, who wants to talk about the future of humanity when we're dealing with so many problems right now? Let's just get right to the helicopter. That's more fun.
Well, it's kind of like what Graham Hancock said when they found the Nag Hammadi library. Like something's
Mhm.
trying to help us remember, when they were found, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. The Gnostics. We'll save that for a few minutes later. The helicopter. So it is important to us as humans to try to. I'm gonna really come at this from a big point of view, because there's people that say it's a helicopter and there's people that say it's not a helicopter. There's people that say this is a symbol for something else, and then there's ancient aliens who's like it's definitely a helicopter, and it's a whole military scene. What I think we as humans do is that we already know that advanced technology existed a long, long, long time ago. Advanced technology that we do not have now, that we don't even know, we can't even fathom how it works. We can't even, I think a couple of us on this planet can imagine how it works, but the rest of us, we can't. But we all know, we feel it. So what we do is we look at something like that looks similar to some kind of military scene, helicopter scene in the Temple of Seti, where they do have, and I do talk about this in my documentary, they do have depictions of an ancient device, some kind of strange technology that exists in Seti the first temple, where the helicopter is. But I do not necessarily think that it is a depiction of a helicopter. I do think that we are tapping into what was there, and we look at that and we're like, that's what it was. They had helicopters. But I don't think they had helicopters. I think that they had something more advanced, something almost like sci-fi teleportation device that was even more powerful than landing a helicopter.
Yeah.
And I think that that's our that's when people are looking for the truth not necessarily is the thing that we see. The truth is what we feel and what we're interpreting our reality at that moment. So what I will say about that is that everybody gravitating toward the fact that in the Temple of Seti the First, they feel like there's a depiction of a helicopter. I would say that everybody that's tapped into that knows that there was advanced technology there, and that is the truth. And whether it was a helicopter or not, I don't know, but I don't think that's necessarily the truth in that temple.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because it can also look like a pharaoh laying down, like a dead pharaoh with the feet
Yeah.
up. But I was looking at that. But the hard part is the other crafts right next to it. You know, one looks like Luke Skywalker getting in and hovering over the sands in a Star Wars scene. The other one looks like an airplane or some kind of craft, flying craft, and then the other one looks like a tank or some kind of submarine or something. So it's really interesting that they're all next to each other. That's the hard part.
Maybe somebody went into a dream state and
Mm.
said, I'm going to carve what I saw in the future. And then they carved all those things. I don't know.
Yeah, it's
I
interesting.
are they tapped into the zeitgeist of Star Wars, and Star Wars then became their inspiration for their art.
Well, it seems
uh
like they channeled something through Star Wars and Star Trek because you have the Jedi kind of stuff coming from Egypt as well, right? You ever
yeah.
hear that?
Um so here's my theory on that, and I believe it happens to me too when I'm writing. And I enjoy it because I don't necessarily fashion myself a channeler, or, I'm not in touch with beings or anything like that exciting like some of the other people maybe you interview. Um, I'm like the most boring interview you have.
No,
But
it's been
but
awesome already.
I do think writers, the gift of writing something like sci-fi is that those are not necessarily your original thoughts. Like you've heard that
Mm.
cliche term. There's no such thing as an original thought. Because there's no such thing as an original thought because when you're writing, you're channeling dimensions of time and space. Whether it's a romantic comedy, you're in another reality and you're creating that and you're downloading the characters and the situation and all that, right? But when it comes to things like Star Wars, I find it really fascinating that even before Star Wars came out, there was people that wrote books about some of the similar themes. So it exists in another dimension of time that we've all experienced. That's why when Star Wars came out, I mean, when the first movie came out, if you watch the first Star Wars, it's not like big, but it's like the 80s. It's a little cheesy. There's some cheap
Think,
stuff. We don't have the graphics and CGI that we have now, but um and that script got passed on so many times. They told him he was a terrible writer, the characters are campy, never get made, blah 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 blah. But the thing is, when it got made, people went crazy because they felt it made sense to them. So when like Star Trek was also channeled. I mean, Gene Roddenberry that wrote Star Trek, he even admitted that he would go into deep states of meditation and channel all the characters. He even got to the point, at the point, I think it was in 1906, and I can't remember the exact year that Star Trek came out, but I think he was working with Paramount Studios. He channeled all these multi-dimension, or not multiracial cast. And in the 1960s, this was unheard of. There wasn't Asian people and black people like on a full like that like on the full actor scope of the way he wrote those characters into this setting in space, right? And he had channeled all of that, and he felt that in the future it wouldn't make sense that they wouldn't all be working together. They wouldn't have a world understanding and then out in space, and it didn't make any sense to him. So he had channeled this whole thing, and the studios fought him on that. They said, no, we can't do that. Like, nobody will watch it, blah, blah, blah. He's like, nope, then I won't do it. And it was the first time in history that they had a multiracial cast for this sci-fi show, and all of it was channeled. So
Well,
I think that the Star Wars, Star Trek, these epics are in our minds. We're attracted to it because, in a way, we know it is real. The fact that there was wars in space and we were part of them, that is not somehow strange to somebody who's not even having conversations like you and I are. My brother-in-law, who's a neurobiologist and not into anything weird, like, loves that stuff. Guardians of the Galaxy, Marvel, Star Wars. He's a big fan, huge nerd, into it. Why? Because it resonates with him, not because of the CGI and all of that, but because it's a good story. It is something that we have all experienced together, like Egypt, Atlantis, and thanks to writers like that who've just gone out and been like, I'm channeling it, I'm making it, it's happening.
I appreciate what you just said. Is when I grew up in the neighborhoods in LA, and right there by not far from Catalina, where they found giant bones. But
Oh, cool.
anyways, I always felt like as a little kid that anything I could imagine exists in it somewhere else. And I remember looking as a young boy, and I would watch that Indiana Jones scene, and I knew I lived somewhere in India. Um, I don't know if that
Hmm.
was filmed in India, but I knew that environment, right? Or remember those old kung fu movies on regular TV back
Yes.
in the weekends when
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
you could tell it's translated. Um, anyways, I knew I lived in that type of environment in a past life, and I also knew that I lived somewhere like Star Wars in a past life. Like I had
Hmm.
this little glimpse of remembrance as a young kid, and I wasn't raised with spirituality, religion, or any of that kind of stuff, but I just had this inner knowing. That's the best way to
Hmm.
describe it. So I've always been fascinated with like ETs and UFOs and Bigfoot and ancient history. Yeah, it's just so. But when I had my awakening, I started to like everything just dropped. Like all the worldly identifications that I was all stuck in that kept me in ignorance, and I
Hmm.
went back to those teachings in the East, which was interesting.
Hmm. Interesting. So when you say the East, are you thinking that you lived in India, or did you live in Asia, where China, Japan, like what
Yeah,
resonates with you?
I think I lived in I lived in somewhere in China, ancient China. I know I lived in the Himalayas, and I lived
Mm.
in somewhere in India before. Yeah, in other places, I think I had a little bit of remembrance as well. I always trip out. I don't know if you remember going to school and there would be like one white kid with all the black kids, and then the white kids will be like, he thinks he's black, or one black kid with all the white kids, and he thinks he's white. And I always thought this, like maybe they have, well, maybe they remember their spacesuit from a past life, and they're still attached to a certain culture. I don't know. You never
Mm.
know. It's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, it is weird when we're kids and we resonate with things that we would have no
Yeah.
experience at. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin of like 6,000 people. I think there was more cows than people at one point. So, I mean, we didn't live on a farm, but it was like in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't really any culture. There wasn't, but my parents spent a lot of time teaching us about all different kinds of religions, and we would my dad would read us Greek mythology, and so there, like, by the time I got to college, even though I came from this really isolated place, I had like a worldly view of everybody had a story and everybody had a connection, everybody was part of something, even though I had never experienced it. But I remember being a kid, and I was so fascinated with ancient Egypt. Go figure. And one of the things, because I get interviewed for a lot of podcasts about aliens, because I've done a lot of stuff on, Discovery Channel about aliens and written shows about aliens. And always the question is, when did you start to believe in aliens, or when did you get interested in this kind of stuff? And I know I don't really have a starting point because there was never a part of my childhood or my existence that I can remember when I thought there's definitely aliens or not aliens. I just always was like, well, that seems plausible. I mean,
Mm.
it just, I mean, it didn't, it definitely crossed my mind. My dad used to be in the military. We used to talk about it all the time. I had
Really?
questions, but it never was like impossible. It just didn't feel like, of course, that would be real. I mean, as much as we know and don't know about science, I mean, could be real. So I think it's so weird. I think anybody listening to this podcast, just take note, like write down in a journal, like what are all the weird things that you've been sort of drawn to? It could be anything from like a symbol or like you like collecting Native American warheads or something, like you there's those little pieces of your personality that came out of nowhere, like they have nothing to do with your upbringing or your parents or where you grew up. Like those little things are the pieces to your soul that you're missing, that you're calling back out to,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing I do want you to touch on is the reoccurring dream that you had, which I thought was fascinating in your film.
Yeah. Um, so one of the big parts of the motivation of this documentary was a dream that I had since I was 10. And it didn't make any sense to me then. It wasn't scary, so it wasn't something that I was I would talk to my parents about it, but it was just kind of didn't seem like anything. I didn't have any knowledge to understand it, but basically I'm in a desert, a specific desert, um, which I feel like I've located, I think, where it is. It's not even in Egypt or anything, but this desert, I'm walking in the desert. I have strange clothes on, clothes, ancient looking kind of clothes. I'm not can't see myself. I can only see my hands, and I'm holding a staff, and the desert is completely barren. And I take the staff and I find the same location every time in this reoccurring dream, and I hit the staff into the sand. And then from there comes these concentric circles that light up, golden concentric circles that light up around me, come underneath the sand and out. And then there's 12 spokes that light up in that circle. And all those dots light up. And then dream ends, flash out with light.
Wow.
And that
Wow.
was until probably my early mid 20s, and then it just ended and just stopped having it. But I mean, obviously I didn't forget it, but around that time I had moved to LA, beginning of my 20s after college, and I started kind of, I was working for space shows and then eventually got myself into alien work. I've always been a big nerd, right? I just love all
That's
this stuff.
awesome. I love it.
And and I would notice these symbols. I would see all these symbols, and I'm like, oh, the concentric circles and the 12 and then over time, I mean, you remember this is I'm still pretty young, but this is like several years ago. I'm not gonna tell you how old I am, but um I started to really, because I had, especially working at Gaia as head of content for 5 years. I was just absorbing so much information that I thought I keep seeing the same thing and it's everywhere and no one talks about it. It's not something on people's heads that they're thinking of. They're not, they mention it, it's here, it's there, it's the 12, it's but it's not a big deal. It's just in passing. And then they focus on something else. And I thought this is the pattern that there's something missing here that I must dive into. And I feel that dream, and if anybody's listening that has dreams or visions, or they meditate, they see something, or they see a number, they see a repeating number, all of these, again, just like our little tiny personality obsessions that we have about things, I think are pieces of ourselves that are wanting us to come back. I mean, in this case, mine was a
Mhm.
vision, which I talk about in this movie, but that vision is a piece of me in maybe another dimension of time and space that was like, remember this, you must remember this lifetime. And for some reason, they were bleeding into each other purposely. And of course, I don't have an answer for why that happens, why I must, of all the lifetimes, why that one thing needs to be in this one. But, maybe at the end of my life, I will figure that out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you were a deep mystic in other lives, and I consider you a filmmaker mystic today. So I appreciate
Filmmaker
it.
mystic. I think I might use that. Do you mind if I steal that?
No, it's all
It's gonna
yours.
be my
It's
lower
you.
third from now. Filmmaker mystic. Not just a filmmaker. Everybody's a filmmaker, but I'm a
Yeah.
filmmaker mystic. I love it. I'm gonna steal that. I mean, look at my cup. It's perfect.
Well, yeah, I love it. Like my logo. Actually
Oh
made that
yeah.
in created
It's
that
like the
in Egypt
eyeball.
on the Nile River. Oh yeah.
Cool.
Speaking of like the sands and stuff, I want to go into Mesopotamia and speak about the Sumerians and the A word, the Anunnaki.
The A word. Yes. Okay. Let's dive into the A word.
What's your understanding of that Sumerians and the Anunnaki?
The A word. I remember Graham Hancock said once in an interview I did, he's like, you can talk about Sumeria, but the minute you mention the Anunnaki, things have gotten more complicated and you can never really find the answers. And I would agree with that. Because the Anunnaki, from a, let's say, mainstream archaeology, anthropology standpoint, we're definitely a group of people that came from some place far away. There's theories that they came from Siberia and they traveled down, and that meant that they came from the sky, right? Like this understanding that they came from a far place up north, and they came to kind of um, civilize the people that were in the Middle East at the time. And so there's that kind of theory that they existed, and then they created this civilization. And there is some basis to that, given the fact that now that there's some melting in Siberia, they found that cave with the now group of Denisovans, which is an ancient group of like giant people, not giants like that they're keeping under wraps at the Smithsonian, but the giant people, huge jaws. They found like teeth jaws in this cave, and it was a subset of humans called the Denisovans that lived 50,000 years ago. Did they travel? Did those kinds of people travel down to the Middle East, and then were they the Anunnaki? Right. So these are all things that are talked about in mainstream. Now, the more fun version of the Anunnaki is that they were part of this spacefaring race. They're part of their mythology, which sounds a little bit like Star Wars, right? Like there's this battle in space. There's these gods, this goddess. There's Tiamat. There's An, who's like the great god, and there's this fighting between them, and they have to take refuge in Earth, and then they end up kind of civilizing Earth as kings and queens and creating the Garden of Eden and creating us as slaves, and then the story goes on and on. Now, what I think is really interesting about this is that this is the Sumerians, according to mainstream, were around before the ancient Egyptian civilization that we talk about in mainstream. But if you talk to people that are doing work in Egypt, they would say that's really not the case, right? That there was something happening with Atlantis and then traveling over, and then you have this subset called the Anunnaki in Sumeria. I think that the Anunnaki, of course, my psyche wants to believe that they were aliens and they came down and they messed with our genetic code and they created us from Neanderthals into this kind of slave race to do their bidding, and they're half reptilian and all that stuff. I mean, that's just more exciting, right? I mean, if you live in that world, I mean, anything can happen. But I would warn that the Anunnaki have a very similar tale to the beginning of civilization and what the warnings of civilization are. This idea that our genetic code was messed with is definitely a highly debatable subject matter with mainstream and with esoteric means and alternative views. There's the idea of the missing link. There's something that happened to our DNA like overnight, and that cannot be explained. That's acceptable. Um, but the story, I want to focus on the story because I'm not the kind of person to tell you they're real or not real, but I want to focus on the Anunnaki story. The idea of the garden, the idea of the Garden of Eden in the Bible is that God created it perfectly for them. And then he said, just don't eat from this tree. And then the woman got curious because she was bored and she was like, okay, I'm going to eat from the tree because the snake told her to. And and then this representation, and then of course she feeds it to Adam, and then they have to get kicked out of the garden, and God's mad. So this transfers over to the Anunnaki story because there's two brothers that have been kind of abandoned here on Earth to start this new civilization that they then have the humans help them with as they created them genetically, so the mythology goes. And they create this garden for them. They create this space for them. Just don't ask questions. Just, do your work, be a good human, and all will be well. But of course, that's one brother's version. And the other brother, Enlil, was like, no, 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 no. You should ask questions. You should practice free will. And this is the greatest evil that all humans have come into contact was to practice free will, because now you've angered the gods, because you can speak against the gods because you are practicing free will. And so there was no more garden, there was no more safety. The gods weren't here to save, they were here to control us now because we were practicing free will. So there's a couple themes here that are really important to think about as you or anyone else diving into the Anunnaki history, is that the theory that God created us and then wanted to keep us ignorant seems like something that somebody or something would create to make sure that we stay ignorant, because that seems like bliss, right? Number one. Number two, it's the woman's fault. She's the one who got curious. Well, thank God. Otherwise, we'd all be just living in the garden, doing work and not asking questions. Number three, the concept that now we will be punished and suffer now for the rest of our existence as our creation from the gods because we have asked who we are and why, I think is a really crippling understanding of the creation of who we are. And this story of the Anunnaki has driven people to really answer those questions. Who am I and why am I here?
Right.
And I think that in its entirety, let's take out the aliens and the mainstream view, is really the purpose of our obsession with the Anunnaki. It's different than Egypt and Atlantis. The Anunnaki are the concept of Anunnaki. The Anunnaki is to really understand who we are and why we are here. And I think that is why we can't get them out of our head. We want to blame, we want to get angry that there's this thing, there's these people, they're still here, they're still overlooking us, they're still wanting us to do things for them, that we suffer because they created us and therefore they still control us. I think that thinking is limiting, because they actually can't do anything if we don't believe that. And maybe that's why they were mad. They were upset. God was mad. God was mad that they asked too many questions, because they would realize how powerful they are. And I think the purpose of the mythology of the Anunnaki is that they might have created a civilization of which we suffer, that we believe in, and then we get mad that we suffer. But we have at all times the ability to practice free will. And they did give that to us, even if they tell us that we must suffer.
I love that. Thank you. I appreciate your insights.
I know it's not exciting. I don't have any alien stories for everybody. I'm so sorry.
You know what I find interesting, and I appreciate your take. It's awesome. I'm gonna have to rewatch this. You are you familiar with Gerald Clark? Gerald Clark, he passed away in 2020, I believe. But he
Okay.
kind of Billy Carson and Matt LaCroix looked up to him like a big brother. And Gerald Clark was very humble and just when he would share, I would just tune right in, and he would just blow my mind. But I know Gerald pointed out that there was an Allah character in the Ijiji when they try to revolt against Enlil, which is interesting. I'm not saying that's Allah from Islam, but it's just interesting that there's an Allah character. But he also
Mm,
pointed out, those from heaven to earth came Anunnaki, right? Or those from Anu to earth, they come, right? But what's
hmm
interesting is he pointed out the Our Father prayer, which is just food for thought. Our Father who art in heaven. I wonder if they got some kind of. I know they inherited some of the stories from Mesopotamia in the Old Testament, but I
Yeah.
wonder if the Lord's Prayer had some kind of was adopted a little bit from this Mesopotamia as well. I'm not saying it is or it's not, but it's just food for thought, which is interesting. Our Father who art in heaven.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. And that brings me actually to a point that'll transition into the Gnostics.
Yes.
I want to back up a little bit though. Do you know the writer Anton Parks? He's French.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So
love him.
he actually does a deeper dive where he goes back. We always know about the Anunnaki. We know about Inky and Inla. We know about Tiamat. We know about but we don't know where those lineages came from. And Anton Parks really goes into the lineages like millions of years ago, like all the different races and how they populated and how they created each every and how they're related. Um, and they're really what he's explaining is many battles in space for power over uh, more people, and then the ability to create new uh, lineages of beings to be slaves, and then those slaves figure out that they don't have to be slaves anymore, and then
Yeah.
they make another being to right, and so then here we are, and this is really fascinating because the only story we hear, the one that we focus on, is the great An defeats Tiamat, and this is in Stitchen's work, right? And then we have Inky and Enlil, and they're here with all the other gods and goddesses, or mostly goddesses, that then come to Earth, and then they start humanity. End of story, sort of. So what I'm about to transition to is the Gnostics and what you said about the Lord's Prayer in and the Anunnaki in Mesopotamia. So the defeating of Tiamat, there's different versions of what happens here, but basically the main one is she's split in half. On Splits her in half basically, and she bleeds all over, and her chest is the mountains, and the water is her blood, and basically she's Mother Earth, and they've split her in half. They've cut her into pieces all over. Then she's defeated. There's no more Queen Tiamat, and to me, this is where we're going to transition into Gnostics. But you have a patriarchy that has now defeated the feminine cultures, right? So before there was the civilization that we know now, we had mostly feminine run civilizations. And
Hmm.
and the civilizations they were not based on law and order. They did not have exchange of some kind of money or trade. Um, in the sense of civilization, as we're speaking about in Mesopotamia, which is supposed to be one of the oldest set of civilization, they did not have a written language because and there's many books on this actually. They're fascinating, and this is relevant right now because we're switching back to the other side. They didn't have a written language because writing would mean that you would have to use another side of your brain. You have to look at the picture, and then you've got to translate it, use the other side of your brain to then come up with the wording that describes the thing, right? So when you only when you see a cat and you draw cat, then you see the cat, you draw cat, right? It's like emojis. I'm happy, emoji happy. You don't write happy, right? So this is where we're reversing back to another part of our brain, which is more feminine. So this moment of this mythology is the defeating of all of these kind of goddess cultures completely into the patriarchal law and order, money exchange, coming into, in my film, we talk about base 10. This is really using that base 10 structure, financial system. Everything had an ownership instead of, and the written language too was a big part of this. If you knew how to read and write, then you were able to own property. You were able to be the master of slaves and all this kind of stuff, right? Now, let's transition to Gnosticism. So Gnosticism, in its core, is feminine. It talks about the nature of the feminine being the void, being the creator, right? Not the father, right? As my father who art in heaven. Now, we're not saying that the father didn't exist. We're saying that in ancient cultures, before the defeating of, for the sake of the conversation, Tiamat, they knew that the creation would come from the void of the female, and that was to be worshipped. And men were to protect that. They were the protectors. They were the protectors. When God says, you are the keepers of the animals and the trees and the plants, right? Though that's men. They're the protectors. Women are the creators, right? And then we changed that story to men are the creators and women do what they're told, right? They're no longer have the wisdom of this. So Gnosticism kept that vein, and in the vein of that understanding of the universe, all of the laws and orders didn't make any sense. None of that made any sense at all. It didn't even compute, because that's not really how creation works. And so this is this is why people like Graham Hancock are so fascinated with Gnosticism, because if it wasn't for the Nag Hammadi, that not all of it was found, but some of it was found in the desert, tucked away into a cave. If that wasn't found, we wouldn't even have any of it. But they tried to destroy all of it because it was a different understanding that was so much ancient than the Anunnaki. So I think what you have here is the Anunnaki as a representation of the angry God, the law and order, do what I say, be slaves, be good to God, and he'll be good to you. Where then you have the Gnosticisms where none of this is real, and the universe is made like this, and this is how it works, and it's chaotic and it has order, but it has nothing to do with the law and order and the scruples and the things and the blah blah blah, which is our civilization. And it's interesting, thank God somebody thought it was a great idea to hide them where they did.
Yeah,
that
right.
Now we have that text, and for a very long time, and even recently I did an interview where I talked about how I put a lot of this in ancient civilizations, to show that we opened this talking about on Gaia, that we got a lot of flack saying that we were worshiping the devil and it was about Lucifer. And of course, being the head of content, I can't really respond. Now that I'm not the head of content, I can say, well, none of that has to do with devil worshiping, because it has nothing to do about evil. It has to do about how the universe is a different take than maybe what you're used to. And the only people that are afraid that were writing into Gaia saying it was like devil worshiping and whatever were men. So I was like, okay, what are you afraid of? Go back to your Anunnaki story. Have fun with that.
I love it. I was talking to
There's
Brett.
nothing wrong with. I think that sometimes, because I'm a woman, I'm obviously talking about this, so it would make sense to the person listening to this or watching this podcast that, oh well, I'm passionate about it because I'm a woman, and I'm fighting for women's rights or whatever. But well, of course I have an opinion about that, but I would say that it's not about being right or wrong. It's just a different way of looking at the universe, and we're at a point now where kind of the old stuff isn't working. So why not look over here and see how that could benefit everybody, not just females, but everyone, no matter where you are.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Do you think there's a reason why the Ankh, the oval part of the Ankh, was taken out into just a regular cross? Do you think there's a connection there?
Oh, wow. What a really good question.
Because they're wiping out the female aspect, right?
Yeah,
the energy.
The womb. Right. Possibly.
That makes sense to me.
Well, That's okay. Well, let me take it this way. That I've never thought of it that way. So that is really fascinating. So thank you. I've never thought of it being like the womb or the half circle representing female. And
Sophia.
that very well could be actually from the symbolism point. But I would say that that there's a hmm, the cross. The cross represents another part of that technology that I think that all the symbols, and this is going to be a bit of a tangent. It's not necessarily about taking away the feminine or not, but I feel that the splitting of all this knowledge kind of thrown up all over the world, like you and I having conversations, other people having conversations, people writing books, like siloing all this information, is because they wanted to make sure nobody would piece it back together again. Nobody would
Mm,
ever figure out how the universe works. Because if you figured out how the universe works, you know what? You're leaving the garden and, God's going to be mad. So I think that these symbols all work together. I honestly believe that the cross, the ankh, the infinity symbol, the concentric circles, the swastika, before it turned evil, before the Nazis used it for evil to represent evil, was a sign of love, was a peace. I mean, if you
yeah.
go into the jungles of some of the Asian countries, you'll see temples with swastikas on them from thousands of years ago because they weren't evil, right?
Mm.
So all of these symbols, and there's about six or eight, yeah, I think there's about eight of them together, I think are part of some kind of ancient technology. What that is, I don't really know, but I don't think the cross is not insignificant. It is very significant, but it is part of the larger meaning. And all of these symbols that are used all over the world for different religious groups are actually supposed to be working together. That is my theory.
I love that. Thank you. I There's so much I would love to ask you. We're running out of time. Maybe I can get your take on the difference between spirituality and religion, or is there a difference at all?
Well, religion is an organized way to practice spirituality. Spirituality, you don't need to do really anything. You can be spiritual without saying anything. You can be spiritual without buying the mala beads. You can be spiritual without, even saying a mantra. You can just be connected to that of which is your God-given right, which is the universe. And religion is an organized way to connect. And so I always want to say religion is not bad. It's only bad when it's used to control people, when it's used to control the thoughts and minds of people. And usually for some reason, unfortunately it is. And I think when it got created, they wanted to create groups of community of people, because humans like to do that, where they would come together and they would remember together how to connect. And then from there, somebody got the bright idea, well, I'm better at connecting than these people, so maybe I should be in charge of the thing, and then I'll create a whole ritual about me and that, and then I'll write a book about it. Perfect, right? And so then now we have organized religion with all sorts of things, but I think in its pure form, it was a group community, group gathering of how to remember how to connect to what they were given. But just remember, spirituality is also a way to control people. The word spirituality is
Yeah,
just
you're right.
thrown out all over the place. Love and light, be friends with your neighbor, and be nice and kind to people and be spiritual. I'm a spiritual warrior. Like, what does that mean? Like, these are just words. These are words to control you to be something that you don't even have a root to. It has nothing to do with people or your shirt or that you're nice. It has to do with the fact that you're connected. If you're connected, you don't need to be anything. You
Yeah,
just are. And therefore, you don't need to be anything with other people. You are what is the universe, which I guess in its state is not evil. It is, something profound, like that thing I felt in the temple. I don't even have a word for that.
no, I love it. Thank you. And I totally agree with the word spirituality. I mean, if you look at the word spiritual, there's the word ritual. And I
Mm-hmm.
was part of a spiritual community that, oh, this is a spiritual movement. But those rituals put me to sleep. They created dogma in me. And I had to
Mm.
look at that to wake up from that and to free myself from a frozen heart, because that dogma will eat up your heart and really us against them mentality, really,
Yeah.
water the ego in an unhealthy way. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. You know what I find interesting? Yogananda died in 1952, and I was telling Brad Olson this the other day. Um, but he basically shared what the Gnostics were teaching, which I found interesting because it wasn't translated until after he was gone, what Yogananda was saying. And
Hmm.
then they find the Gnostic text in 1945, which I thought was interesting. And he talked about self-realization, and I think that's what the Gnostics were teaching, to go within yourself,
Yeah.
which I found very interesting because Yogananda didn't have these Gnostic texts because they weren't translated yet. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because he was connected. He was connected with
yeah,
that
yeah.
which is the universe. I mean, in Code 12, that's basically the point, is that there's something else living with around us all the time that we don't see, that we can be connected to, that we are part of that bigger structure.
Mhm.
And it's just a reminder that this of which that we suffer within is our own creation. We've decided that this is the way we want to live, and then we find blame in people, and then we come up with all these things like dogma to like somehow
Yeah,
get rid of our suffering. But the thing is, there's something right here that is God all the time, and when you see it, like Yogananda did, when you see it, it's just so joyful that you want to tell people about it. And it doesn't need to be anything except for the joy and the peace that comes out of his mouth. Like the greatest teachers, I mean, I'll use the word spiritual for the sake of the conversation. The greatest spiritual teachers, leaders, are speaking joy without doing. And people that are in their presence feel that joy in themselves, not because they're telling them to do anything, but because they're speaking a truth that is alive inside of them. And so I can say that for you or anybody else listening, if you are in the presence of someone or you're reading something that causes so much joy in your heart, then you're on the right path. There's nothing you need to do. There's nothing you need to buy. It just is. And anybody who's speaking that truth, that will come through.
yeah. Thank you. And I think in Code 12 you talk about that ancient field or that invisible field, right?
Hmm.
Which I wish we would have got into the 100th monkey, but
Oh my God. Yeah, there's so much to talk
yeah,
about.
maybe another time.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you coming on. I really do, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff. So we should do it again. We
Yeah,
can
me too.
another vein and go deep.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna end it with the Osho quote. And Osho
Okay.
said, Adam and Eve did not commit any major crime. They had a little curiosity. I think anybody who had any sense would have done the same. It was absolutely certain to happen because there is a deep need in man to know. It's intrinsic. It's not. It's not a sin. So I want to say thank you for your
Mm.
curiosity, because I don't know if you realize it, but you're changing the collective. You're very powerful. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was a gift. Thank you for that. And so are
Take
you,
care.
my friend.
Thank you. Word
Bye.
master. Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on a day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.